terrifying, mysterious, unpredictable, striking, chaotic, dramatic, poetic, and even beautiful. That is the idea of death. And even though many cultures and religions have their own interpretations of death, the most well-known and widespread version is this human skeleton covered in a black cloak wielding a scythe. In Runeterra, there's a certain deathly reaper that's a bit peculiar. In fact, this deathly incarnation is actually a duo, and at the same time, one. And what they use as a weapon isn't exactly a scythe, but I'm sure everyone's going to love getting to know them.
Where we go,
they retreat.
And for those who already know them, you're going to love learning even more.
Do they know, little lamb?
They will.
So without a further ado, today here on the channel as our special guests, Kindred.
Shall we, dear wolf?
I'm ready, little lamb.
The most famous Shinigami. Maybe a lot of people don't know this, but there are actually several spirits that act as gods of death, since that title and role aren't something exclusive to Kindred. For example, we know that over in Ionia, there's the Spirit Blossom, and that Kindred are a part of the local folklore. In that version, Lamb is a girl, and Wolf is her loyal, beast-like companion, and the two of them spend their time playing together when they're not out there doing their job. But for the Kinku Order, the story is different. Even though they respect the spirits of Kindred, they only really believe in and talk about two gods. This duo, by the way, is both completely opposite and perfectly complementary to each other, and they're known as the First Wave and the Last Wind. The First Wave, whose design resembles a fish with arms and legs, cradles life in its warm waters, while the Last Wind, which I believe takes the form of a heron, takes life away with its cold, final breaths. Over in Targon, some tribes tell stories about the astral fox, a death deity represented by a lone star in the sky, and according to legend, with every new death, this entity descends to the mountain and guides the soul up to the heavens, creating its own dark constellation. But among all the death gods that exist across Runeterra, it's fair to say that Kindred are the ones with the most recognition and fame, something that even other death gods, whether older or younger than Kindred, and whether they like it or not, end up admitting.
I was feared once, just as you are now.
What's that, lamb?
Something soon forgotten, dear wolf.
Lamb, tell me a story.
As you wish, dear wolf.
Yours is known across the lands.
Such grace in the spider's dance.
And strength in its jaws.
It is nothing to the elegance of the Kindred's hunt.
And honestly, they're probably also the death gods with the most interpretations, whether across different regions or even through the eyes of different races, coming from both the physical and the spirit realm. The basic appearance of Kindred as we know them reflects the way they show up in the mythology of Southern Freljord, which is their oldest and most widespread representation, with their masks becoming a universal symbol across many cultures. However, they can take on many different forms depending on local stories, beliefs, and relationships with death, even when it comes to names. Even though Kindred is their universal name, the Lamb and the Wolf are known by many others, including Inna and Ani in the west, and Freya and Wolo in the east. As mentioned in the short story All Kindred Eve, which is exclusive to the book Realms of Runeterra, Kindred are seen by the Shirimans as elegant gazelles with fangs, accompanied by spotted hyenas, and by Ionians as a snake and a sparrow. Some Ionians also imagine them as the Taker, which is that version from Spirit Blossom, like I mentioned earlier. Other interpretations include a caged fish and a small fish, a stag with bloodied antlers and an elegant hair, a rose and a bee, and some northern myths, maybe not specifically from Southern Freljord, portray Lamb as an Elnuk. In Bilgewater, there's a festival known as Kindred's Eve, held in their honor, where people from all the islands gather at a place called the Witch's Tree Rock to reenact the story of Kindred. During the festival, a fight is staged between the most cowardly person in Bilgewater, known as Lamb's Fool, and a strong individual called the Wolfkin Warrior, with the outcome determining how people of Bilgewater will behave in the following year. The competition is often rigged in the favor of the wolf, because if Lamb were to win, the people of Bilgewater wouldn't be allowed to lie, cheat, or kill for an entire year. Also, the Bilgewater version of Kindred myth describes a pale rider who rode a great black beast, someone people avoided, because looking at him meant death. One night he arrived at a fork in the road, with a lemon tree standing in the middle. He knelt before the ancient tree and split himself right down the middle, with an axe so he could walk both paths. One road led into a deep, dark forest, and the other to a city of light. The two paths eventually meet again, and the two halves of the Pale Rider had changed, even though they were still the same. They cast the axe into a river and chose to walk side by side forever, so they would never be alone. And if you're wondering how Kindred can appear in more than one place at the same time, it's because they don't follow the usual rules of space and time, which gives them a unique perception of the universe and explains why they can be present in multiple places simultaneously. When it comes to their forms, we already know it's tied to cultural beliefs and interpretations, but it's also suggested that people from cultures that don't even have a version of the Kindred myth aren't visited by them at all. And because of that, they didn't come for Mordekaiser when he was still Sanuzal at that moment of his natural death, even though Mordekaiser in his Sanuzal skin does have interactions with them.
You are no gods. I will strike you down. You are no death of mine.
I think that even if he did learn about Kindred during his campaign of domination, it didn't really matter for Sanuzal, since they weren't a part of his culture or understanding. He saw Kindred more as mediocre spirits that needed to be removed from his path. And apparently, Kindred also have no connection or influence over Mordekaiser's death realm, also known as Mitna Raknun, even though the place is also called the Grey Realm, which kind of reminds me of someone we'll talk about later. Concepts and inspirations. Of course, when you look at Kindred and notice their personalities, their color aesthetics, and that opposite yet complementary duality we have, yin and yang is something you can easily associate with them. And yeah, that's actually correct. But would you believe me if I told you they were also based on an old fable created by a Greek writer named Aesop? Yeah, the story of the wolf and the lamb. The version of the story I found goes like this. In the middle of a forest, a wolf comes across a lamb, while both are drinking from a stream. And to justify taking the lamb's life, the wolf accuses it of several crimes, all of which the lamb proves to be impossible. Losing his patience, the wolf replies that the offenses must be committed by some other member of the lamb's family, and tells it not to delay his meal any further by asking questions.
No more words.
Before we keep going, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a member. You'll get access to some really cool perks like picking video topics or getting early access to videos. So yeah, based on that story, the moral is that a tyrant will always find a reason to justify their tyranny, and that the unjust won't listen to the reasoning of the innocent, since the truth is often twisted to serve the interests of the strong. Now, Kindred's title as the Eternal Hunters is a reference to the Wild Hunt, a theme that historically appears in the European folklore, involving a ghostly or supernatural group of hunters, dressed in hunting gear and accompanied by horses, hounds, or other animals, all racing wildly across the sky, through the land, or above it. It was believed that witnessing the wild hunt was an omen of some catastrophe like war, plague, or at best, the death of whoever saw it. And people who crossed paths with it could also be taken to the underworld or the Fey realm. In some cases, it was even believed that people's spirit would be pulled away during their sleep to join the ride. The last part was used even more in shaping how the afterlife is perceived by Noxians. In their case, warriors who die in battle go to Volraknun, a place that exists within the spirit realm, described as a dreamlike world of death, with a dark corridor, pillars of black stone, and heroic figures carved into the walls, all lit by blood-red glow. Volraknun is ruled by Kindred, interpreted by Noxians as a fearsome multi-headed wolf that collects great warriors after death. And there, these fallen warriors face wolf's trials, where those considered worthy and who pass both tests, one of strength in combat and the other of personal sacrifice, earn the right to join the Eternal Hunt. Kindred may also have been inspired by another literary character, in this case, Death from the Sandman, and also by the work Pretty Deadly. As for the relationship between the wolf and the lamb, it's listed on the wiki that it was based on the relationship of a former rioter, Matthew Foshizel Garcia Dunn, and a former senior narrative writer at Riot and his wife. And yeah, this is the same guy responsible for contributing to several champions, including Kindred, as well as reworks like Ezreal and Mordekaiser, the Rise cinematic, and also a ton of amazing short stories. But in the end, Riot laid him off during that big purge where they let go of a huge number of employees, especially more than half of the narrative team. Matthew was actually fired during a really tough moment in his life, since his wife had just been diagnosed with breast cancer and his father passed away from COVID. Getting back to Kindred, and now moving on into their conceptual phase, we can take a look at each of them in this image. The concepts more on the left show that they were considered giving lamb clothing. You can see versions with a poncho, vest and pants, a coat, and even a dress. We can also see that lamb was supposed to have a kind of shepherd's staff, which makes sense, and is even a bit ironic since that tool is used by shepherds to guide the flock, keep sheep from staying off the path, protect them from predators, and also pull them back when they're in danger after getting stuck or isolated somewhere. It also helps the shepherd keep balance on rough terrain. Now, the figures closer to the right side, even though most of them also share the idea of having clothing, bring some really striking and interesting elements, starting with that bulkier version of Lamb, which actually looks way more human, and I don't even think it's female. And even though all of them have a bow, two specific designs make it clear that Wolf would literally be fired, acting as Lamb's arrow. That would have been insanely cool if they had taken that idea further. Also, Kindred, or at least the Lamb, had an aesthetic at one point that made them look like some kind of Egyptian deity, and some of the silhouettes leaned more masculine while others more feminine. Now, this concept right here is definitely one that intrigued me the most. Starting with this image on the left, where we have a chubbier lamb that's sitting there kind of radiating energy, and that dark throne, almost with a Game of Thrones vibe, is actually Wolf's body. The interesting detail in this concept is that Kindred display a symbol of an inverted triangle with an eye in its center, glowing with a greenish tone. That symbol, even though it was scrapped, was later used to represent the Blessed Isles, and that greenish tone is very similar to the color palette used for the Shadow Isles today. Going back to the concepts, this one in the middle was really interesting. Remember when I said at the beginning of the video that Death in Runeterra isn't just this Grim Reaper from our world? Well, it almost was, and it actually got conceptualized that way. This gave me a strong Soul Eater vibe, and the craziest part is that both Wolf and Lamb would manifest and alternate between each other, taking turns inhabiting that masked sheep-like body. You can see that the lamb on the left is covered in blood and claims to be the true predator, unlike Nasus and Warwick, two characters that are tied to animals that are related to each other. On top of that, her scythe literally has Wolf's face on it. Meanwhile, the lamb on the right is completely clean, doesn't say anything, and has her own mask on the scythe. This would probably have some kind of mechanic similar to Jace or Elise, where you can switch between forms and who's controlling the body. And the third concept, Lamb doesn't change that much, but Wolf definitely does. Just look at that bow, it's insane. It almost looks like Sasuke's Susanoo crossbow, and even though that idea didn't move forward, you can see it being reused today in Vayne's demon curse skin, since when she ults, the demon appears behind and above her, mimicking her shooting movements. And believe it or not, even when they were getting close to the final concept, Wright was still considering a lot of ideas. In this concept alone, there are several mechanics and abilities that were considered but ultimately scrapped, like Lamb's shots, which would have had a light effect, with darkness orbiting around the arrow. I might be reaching here, but that honestly looks like the shot that Senna used to save Lucian in that cinematic. You can also see that this shot was supposed to have a falling effect that spreads it into an area, similar to Varus's E. Then we have, once again, the idea that Lamb would be able to shoot Wolf, and below that, there's Lamb riding on Wolf. And at the very end of the image, you can see Lamb performing this shooting motion, while Wolf appears as a shadow forming a bow in the place of her arm and launching multiple shadow arrows. Now, for those who always wanted to know what Lamb's face looks like under the mask, just check out this unmasked concept there. It's not exactly pretty, but considering how many furries are in the League community, I'm sure some people liked it. And since we're already on the topic of concepts, I'm gonna bring up one that's pretty controversial. I bet a lot of people are gonna jump to the comments criticizing me for even using this image as a thumbnail, saying I used AI or something, but no guys, this version of Lamb with a more monstrous body, let's say, is actually official Riot material, and it almost ended up being the final version of how she would look in the cinematic still here. The studio responsible for that cinematic was Unit Image, which is known for working with high quality 3D animations, but they ended up adding some details that made some people uncomfortable. That probably caused some internal backlash, since they had to redo that version. But putting all the weird stuff people project onto Lamb aside, I actually really liked what they did with Wolf, making him huge instead of just a floating head with a more ethereal, smoky body. And seeing him up close is even cooler. Plagiarism, accusations, and an official statement from a rioter. But Kindred's story isn't all sunshine. Back when they were released, people started raising the possibility that Riot had committed plagiarism against a work of a Mexican artist named Kiara Batista. The League community then started putting together a timeline, looking at Kiara's first post on Facebook back in 2013, where she introduced two characters, Starwolf and Bunny Girl. According to the article where I found this, Kiara ended up posting dozens of drawings around the time Kindred were released. She was never really part of the League community, but because of how structured striking similar the concepts were, and since her artwork came first, a lot of people started asking if she had contributed to Kindred's creation. She said no, and that they just looked very similar to her characters. And even with all the accusations from players and Kiara's followers, pointing out how the images in Riot's final design looked extremely similar, almost identical even, Riot never officially had any employee come out and address the situation. But that wasn't the case with the character Dama. The Balance Enforcer, posted around 12 years ago as a project by 2D artist Samuel Young. These characters were clearly based on the concept of yin and yang. And as you can see on the image, the one on the left is Ma, and the one on the right is Da. Here we can see sketches of expressions and gestures from the twin spirits, and we also get an idea of what their gameplay kit might look like. Samuel's work was so good that a Rioter even went there and liked the post, basically congratulating him on the quality of his work on the forum. But things started blowing up when Kindred got their first teaser on the PBE, where a black and white spiral mark appeared over the characters along with the phrase tied to the file or something like that saying, "They are coming." The community then remembered Samuel's post and the fact that a Rioter had actually reached out because of his work. They immediately jumped to the conclusion that he'd been hired and that his idea was being used. They figured that this meant Da and Ma were finally being released. People started spreading the news so aggressively, making videos confirming it and claiming they had proof that these were the next characters, that Rioter Iniquity had to step in to shut the rumors down, saying the following. What's up, guys? I just wanted to jump in real quick and leave a note for all of you who are going all in talking about the new champion. Yes, those masks you're seeing on the PBE are a preview of the new champion, confirmed. Dama is a really cool concept with a lot of elements, yin and yang, darkness and light, and things that still aren't fully explored in League yet. I'd say this is one of the inspirations, but either way, the concept for our next champion was created on the 26th of this year. So with that note, and after thanking the community and clearing things up, Inequity basically confirmed that yeah, Danma did have some inspirational influence in the creation of Kindred. Man, that was actually pretty cool, and like I said it before in another video, Riot has clause in the Summoner's Agreement that basically sign when we agree the terms and policies. They even ask people not to send them ideas or concepts because if something was created based on material that belongs to them or is directed towards them, they could just make the concept and release it in their own way, sometimes almost identical just with a few small changes. And you can believe me when I say that skins and even other champions have come from things like that. The Gray Man and his true origin. Pale, thin, and with long black hair, that was the original figure of Kindred. And no guys, Kindred haven't existed forever, even though they will exist until the death of everything that breathes. In reality, Kindred were created just like many other death gods across Runeterra, and that happens to be thanks to the Mask Mother, a primordial being that existed since the very beginning of the universe, and who introduced the very concept of death gods into Runeterra. She acts more like a matriarch creator of these figures rather than being a death god herself.
Your face. You were there.
Yes, at the beginning.
Your home is in the stars.
So the story goes, my child. Each spirit woven in tapestry. Everyone woven with care. You spun my tale, I remember. And so many others. Of all the masks, I am the last. And I am the first.
This creation process starts with the Mask Mother, who crafts these masks from the wood of a supposedly enchanted tree. At least that's what Ezreal mentions in his field notes about the original Kindred masks. And I believe the same could apply to the others as well.
You created life on these lands. No, little fish, I created you.
You brought death to these lands.
No, little wing, I brought you.
But then comes to the question, did the Mask Mother actually create the masks of Wolf and Lamb? The oldest records of Kindred talk about ancient masks that were found in the tombs of people long forgotten. That makes me think about the possibility that the Mask Mother placed them there, and that these two figures were born from that.
Death begins your forever fable.
But I personally don't really like that idea, or rather, I'd like to take a different look at it. Because yes, the Mask Mother did create Kindred, but in a more indirect way. First she created the
Gray Man.
And what we might have happened is exactly what legend describes. Even as a death god, by always doing his job alone, and with everything in existence avoiding him as much as possible, the Gray Man eventually fell into a kind of loneliness, almost like a depression. And because of that, he used his own weapon to split his essence into two halves, resulting in Kindred and the two new masks. That's why the Mask Mother had a specific line directed at Wolf and Lamb, asking if they still remember her name.
Do you remember my name? Mother.
Back in that Spirit Bonds narrative from the first Spirit Blossom event, it's implied that through certain interactions that even after being split in two, parts of the Gray Man's essence are still scattered throughout the spirit realm. And there's also a line from Neela that gives some credibility to that idea.
Strange, I feel a third presence, something far older.
It would have been really interesting to see the Gray Man as a card in Legends of Runeterra, but with the state of the game ended up in today, that's probably not happening. Maybe in some future animation or a special Kindred skin, we might finally get to see what he actually looked like. And one interesting thing about Kindred is that even though they are such grand personification of death in Runeterra, they're not exempt from dying. It's said that when only the two of them remain, they will hunt each other until one kills the other, leaving the question of whether Lamb will manage to pierce Wolf first with her arrows, or if Wolf will sink its fangs into the Lamb before that. But it's possible they don't even know this will happen, just like they're not certain about their own deaths or what comes after.
Will we ever die, little lamb?
Perhaps, when at last our masks are forgotten,
What happens then?
it may be that another takes us beyond.
I will fight them.
Of course you will, dear wolf.
But Lamb's theory about the other, in this case Ether Fiend, is real. This incarnation of death takes the form of a massive vulture, and it comes from the gods who have been completely forgotten, even other death gods. Right now, it's hunting the fading icon, an ancient death god from Shurima that takes the form of a toad, and who was forgotten by the Basai. Even though they didn't have a perfect ascension ritual, they were almost immortal when it came to aging, since the effects of time on them were drastically slowed down, to the point where they could live for entire eras. But over the long passage of time, their minds would naturally begin to forget things.
If I'm forgotten, then no. Yes. Soon, little one. Soon. No, I have time. I have time.
With no one left to remember their existence, something called the Second Death happens, where this ethereal demon comes to claim the forgotten god and to take it to the beyond. But based on what the spell card shows, taking them actually means devouring them. You can see it grabbing the fading icon and eating it, with traces of blood spread across its beak and neck and feathers. In Kindred's case, the winner of the final hunt, now alone with no one left to remember them, not even their other half, would eventually be taken by Aetherfiend and consumed to pass on.
Never one.
Without the other.
Their hearts beat strong for now.
Lamb, did you feel that?
Yes, something cold.
They need not know yet.
Knowledge and uselessness. Kindred are aware of what happened to certain characters, and those events end up becoming stories the Lamb tells to Wolf.
Tell me a story, Lamb.
Once there was a star that crashed down to Earth.
Did it crush anyone?
It tried to, dear wolf, but it met its match.
What happened to it?
The star was returned, and from it, a man was reborn.
Tell me a story, Lamb.
Once there was a sacrifice exchanged for an oath.
What was given?
A hand to rule with.
And what was promised?
Nothing that would last.
Tell me a story, Lamb.
Once a little spirit traveled a long road through the dark.
They were alone?
The path they traveled was one all must walk alone.
Where were they going?
The same place that all paths lead, to an end.
We were there.
Yes, we were.
And even though they can't interfere with the undead, and aren't exactly welcome in the Shadow Isles, at least for now, Kindred also have a weakness. They are completely ineffective against the Voidborn, since they don't have a spirit or soul. Udyr himself confirms that last part.
This thing has no spirit. It is empty.
And actually, the Voidborn are dangerous because those who are devoured by them no longer have a soul or spirit. These victims don't have anything left because they are simply erased from existence. So there's no afterlife and you won't see Kindred. But yeah, that's basically it. I'll see you guys in the next video.